In Chapter 22, we talk about hazardous chemicals. We'll explain why hazardous chemicals are necessary for human endeavors and how they can lead to pollution and how we can take steps to prevent, how we can and do take steps to prevent that pollution. So this takes us immediately to the field of toxicology. Toxicology is the study of the harmful effects of chemicals on human health and the environment. Toxicology is a huge field. When I was in graduate school at the University of Kentucky, most of my research focused on toxicology. I was not an official student in the Department of Toxicology, but we worked very closely with the Department of Toxicology. And the Department of Toxicology at the time was a huge department on campus with numerous professors conducting research in different areas of this particular field. So areas of the field includes things like we see on the slide. So human health is certainly a large focus of the field of toxicology. You may think initially that, well, that's the only aspect of the field of toxicology, but that's not true. Environmental toxicology, listed next there, is actually a big part of the field of toxicology. We're very interested in the impact of toxic chemicals on both the environment and especially the organisms that live there in the environment for numerous reasons, some of which we'll discuss during the course of our lecture. Forensic toxicology involves looking at things like drugs, alcohol, and poisons as they impact humans, especially in situations in which a crime has been committed, but not exclusively. And lastly, occupational toxicology is certainly a very big focus. In other words, occupational toxicology is how are people exposed to toxic compounds during the course of their work. This is actually a really large focus, and as we look back very disturbingly at human history, we see many examples of occupations in which people have been exposed to high levels of toxic chemicals, and that has had very severe effects on their overall health. Toxicologists are individuals who are trained in the field of toxicology and experts, therefore experts in the field. Most often, but not always, toxicologists are PhD holding scientists, and they work for institutions such as the ones that we see on the screen. So the National Institutes of Health are certainly a very prominent employer of toxicologists. The National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences are another one. The Environmental Protection Agency, it's quite possible that the EPA employs more toxicologists than any other single organization. The Food and Drug Administration employs toxicologists that are involved in examining the safety of products that are going to be used by humans. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employs a smaller number of toxicologists, but they do employ toxicologists that are involved in looking at environmental toxicology, and even state water regulatory agencies, such as the Kentucky Division of Water here in Kentucky, employ toxicologists. One of the things we notice when we start talking about toxicology is this, that toxicology is mostly a story of dose. And so there we see a famous quote, all things are poison and nothing is without poison, only the dose makes a thing not a poison. And so it's interesting phrasing that we're not accustomed to, but it's certainly true. And so interestingly, it's primarily the dose that makes almost any compound a toxin. Certainly some things are more toxic than others, but I'll be honest with you, one of the kind of disturbing things in toxicology is this, that we don't shoot for zero exposure in most cases. We simply shoot for limiting exposure. We've talked about this before in the course of our class. It's simply not possible in many cases in the world in which we live, in which we need to use these chemicals to come up with a zero exposure. And so what we're interested in is the dose response. And like it or not, these tests are typically conducted on animals. It's possible this will change in the future, but as we look at the model organisms that are used in toxicology testing, we see organisms in the aquatic world, and oftentimes these are aquatic-borne toxins, and so we're testing them on aquatic animals. So we see organisms such as Daphnia, fathead minnows, African clawed frogs are very common test organisms in the aquatic toxicology world. Mice and rabbits, in some cases, are common test organisms in the non-aquatic animal test world. We're interested in the threshold, and so the level at which harmful effects are first observed, or probably more accurately put, the level at which significant harmful effects are first observed. And so on the screen, we see the concentration of the chemical on the y-axis, and we see the time of exposure there on the x-axis. And so we can see that we observe something of a threshold there, a point at which the concentration is high enough that we start to observe significant effects as a result of exposure to the particular chemical. We go over a few basic terms in toxicology, some of which we may have talked about before or you're familiar with from other aspects of your biological education. First, types of exposure. So the first type of exposure we mentioned is acute exposure. In the case of acute exposure, we're exposed to a large concentration of the compound over a very short period of time, and we endure the effects, the organism endures the effects as a result of that exposure. We could use radiation as an example. And so very sadly, there have been times in the course of human history, the Chernobyl disaster is an example in which organisms, including people, were exposed to very high doses of radiation over a very short period of time. And most of those organisms, whether they were people or animals, died in the following hours, days, or weeks as a result of that exposure. However, in toxicology, we probably more commonly encounter something referred to as chronic exposure. And so in the case of chronic exposure, we're exposed to very low doses of the compound over very long periods of time, likely over the course of a lifetime. And so in this case, the effects are not observed for years or decades or even several decades may elapse before a effect of exposure shows up. Carcinogens often fall into this particular category. In other words, cancer-causing compounds that do result in cancer eventually, but not after many years of exposure to the compound. When we quantify the toxicity of a particular compound, we typically express it in terms of lethal dose 50 or lethal concentration 50. These are terms that kind of morbidly refer to the concentration or the dose at which half of the organisms that are exposed succumb or die as a result of that exposure. For example, in the graph that we have on the screen, we have the dose on the x-axis, and we have the percentage of animals that died on the y-axis. And so you can see that when we get to 5.56 grams per kilogram, this is a concentration, of course, that 50% of the animals have died. In this particular case, this is a dose, and so we're not putting the organisms in water and exposing them aqueously to the compound. That is what a lethal concentration would be, and it's a very common way of measuring waterborne contaminants, looking at the concentration that kills half the organisms. But in this case, we're exposing the organisms to a compound in their diet, for example. I'm so sorry to say this, but we may even be force-feeding the organism this particular compound via something referred to as a gavage. But in any case, the lethal dose 50 is the amount in the diet, the amount of the toxin in the diet that leads to the death of 50% of the organisms. And as you can see then, the lower this number, the more potent the toxin. In other words, it takes less of the toxin to kill half of the organisms. Now, we also have another thing that we commonly talk about when we're quantifying the toxicity of a compound, and that is reproductive toxicity. And so reproduction is typically the most sensitive stage to toxins in an organism's life, and oftentimes reproductive toxicity is observed even when the lethal dose 50 or the lethal concentration 50 is quite high for a particular compound. Reproductive toxicity is, at least historically, has commonly been measured in life cycle tests in which we have, for example, an aquatic organism like a Daphnia or a fathead minnow, and we allow them to reproduce over several generations, and we look at the number of their offspring that survive and that have mutations and so forth in order to look at how much a particular compound, a particular chemical affects the reproductive process in these organisms. The organisms are, of course, a surrogate for both other animals and for humans. We spend a brief bit of time talking about where these toxic chemicals come from. Interestingly, because of the world we have created for ourselves as humans, chemicals are necessary for many aspects of our lives. We'll talk about a few small examples during the course of this slide. In fact, there are 84,000 chemicals that are registered for use in the United States. Examples of these chemicals include things such as the polychlorinated biphenyls that we'll talk about next. And so these are compounds that were originally synthesized for use in manufacturing. So just imagine, all the manufacturing plants that exist in the United States and all the different chemicals that are necessary for different steps of that manufacturing process. And saying manufacturing covers all the different types of manufacturing that exist. So it's safe to say that in any manufacturing process, there are a number of toxic chemicals that are necessary for use in that particular process. Just think about AutoZone as an example. Many of the compounds that are present in AutoZone are quite toxic. Antifreeze is a simple example. Look at the brake cleaners that you can purchase at AutoZone. Many of those brake cleaners are chlorinated compounds with very strong warning labels. Things that are for sale, there's no special permit that's needed to purchase those at all. There's all kinds of chemicals that we find in just our normal stores that we encounter on a daily basis. Another extreme example that we don't talk much about in this chapter is dry cleaning. You ever think about dry cleaning? Dry cleaning is a process that requires a number of toxic chemicals. And interestingly, those chemicals have historically been quite problematic to the environment, and as a result, there are a number of laws that are associated with that process now, and a number of steps that must be carried out in order for dry cleaners to operate and use those chemicals. So we now go on to talk briefly about the life cycle of a chemical. And so interestingly, there are different steps that are necessary for obtaining or creating these chemicals, and we see them outlined on the screen here. So the first thing you need to do is obtain the raw materials to create the chemical that you're interested in. And so this can be problematic in itself. And so the mining process can both lead to all sorts of environmental issues and can accidentally introduce the compound you're looking for or other compounds that are associated with the chemical you're looking for into the environment. So then you're actually going to use the chemical in one way or another. And it's quite possible that during the use of the chemical, it's going to escape, and some of it's going to make its way into the environment, or people are going to be exposed to it during the course of its use. Dry cleaning is a good example of that, and of course we see many examples of that in manufacturing as well. Then we come to one of the biggest deals, which is disposal. How are we going to get rid of the chemical once you've gone through this process of creating it and using it? And so disposing of hazardous chemicals is no small thing. Just at universities, for example, universities pay a large sum to have people come each year or possibly each semester and pick up their toxic chemicals and haul those away. It's so expensive because there are many laws associated with this. Someday perhaps we'll talk about some disasters that have happened even in Kentucky. The Valley of the Drums is one famous example of improper disposal of toxic chemicals. But in order to dispose of toxic chemicals today, it has to be done in a very regimented fashion that costs a lot of money, and therefore the people that do that have to charge the clients, universities for example, where they're picking up those toxic chemicals, large sums of money to get rid of those. So there are numerous ways by which these chemicals can be introduced into the environment. The normal use can lead to exposure of humans or introduction into the environment. And then there are also spills where large quantities of chemicals can accidentally be introduced into the environment. Here we have a news report from Kentucky from several years ago in which there was a train wreck, derailment, and therefore wreck, in Rockcastle County, which is a little bit south of Lexington. And there was a state of emergency declared because of the large amount of toxic chemicals that were released from those railroad cars. It's one very common way to move chemicals around via railways. In most cases, you don't want to fly them, and they're very heavy and bulky and hard to move, and so railway transport is quite common. We also see, interestingly, a little sign from the local Jessamine County fall trash pickup. And so, interestingly, there's a very specific list of items that are accepted and that are not accepted based on the toxic chemicals that occur in each of those items. We now spend a bit of time talking about the toxic compounds that we encounter in our world today, beginning with heavy metals. Of the heavy metals, the most dangerous heavy metals are listed on the top of our slide. So we have lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, tin, chromium, zinc, and copper. A few of the uses of these heavy metals are listed on our screen. So these are used in metalworking, as one example. If you have a farm, for example, you have probably used galvanized items, such as a galvanized water tank for your horses or cattle. Galvanization uses zinc that's applied to a very thin layer of steel, and it does a terrific job of preventing rust, but it also introduces some zinc, which is toxic into the environment. Batteries unavoidably have high concentrations of heavy metals found in them. And so, as you know, batteries are problematic in terms of getting rid of them at the end of their lifespan. Electronics oftentimes have heavy metals incorporated into them. Now, there are other compounds as well that are found in electronics that are problematic, but heavy metals are typically a part of electronics. You're familiar with lead-based paint. Lead-based paint was banned in 1978 in the United States, but before that, lead was a common component of paint, which of course was problematic given that paint was applied to the inside of houses and people were continually, especially children, were continually exposed to this lead. And so why are heavy metals dangerous? Interestingly, heavy metals are water soluble and easily absorbed. And so they can be easily absorbed over the skin or across mucous membranes. And their mechanism of toxicity varies, but oftentimes they're responsible for inhibiting the action of enzymes. Mercury is an interesting example and is a potent neurotoxin. We have a picture of the Mad Hatter found on this slide. The term Mad Hatter originated as a result of the fact that people that made hats, referred to as hatters, were continually using mercury, to make the brims of the hats stay in place before they were sold, and they were exposed to high levels of mercury via this particular process. It's also important to point this out. Mercury is ubiquitous. Mercury is found everywhere. Every single state in the United States, except Vermont, has a fish advisory similar to the one that we see in Kentucky because of mercury. And so look at the fish advisory that we see on the slide. It says that all waters in the state of Kentucky are under advisory for mercury. Women of childbearing age and children 6 years of age or younger should eat no more than one meal of fish per week of freshwater fish. Men and women above childbearing age are not included in this warning. And so where does this mercury come from? And the answer is coal-fired power plants. And so interestingly, this mercury enters the atmosphere, spread via clouds, comes back down in precipitation, and then is biomagnified, as we have talked about previously. Both bioconcentrated with, the organism picks it up from the water, and it's biomagnified through the food chain. We have a picture of a flathead catfish on the screen, and so flathead catfish live a long time, up to close to 100 years, perhaps over 100 years, and weigh a lot by the end of their life. At least one record from Tennessee is 120 pounds. And so these old fish that are at the top of the food chain end up with very high levels of contaminants such as heavy metals as a result of biomagnification. Pesticides are another category of toxic compounds that are widely used in the environment today. So 2.3 million tons are used annually, and as we have discussed previously in class, we've created a world in which we cannot survive. We can't produce enough food to meet the demand for consumption worldwide without the use of these pesticides. So the pros of pesticide use are, of course, enhanced food production capacity and perhaps reduce disease as well. And so it's important to keep in mind that many diseases are spread by insects. If we consider things like malaria, African sleeping sickness, Zika, West Nile virus, all of those are spread by insect vectors. And so the use of pesticides can reduce, or in some cases eliminate, the spread of those diseases. The downsides are that these pesticides are typically somewhat toxic. Now, we do want to point out that we're better at, as we have talked about in the pesticide chapter, making specific pesticides than we used to be, but still, as we have also mentioned, there are both unintended effects or effects on non-target organisms, let's say, and some toxic effects on on organisms such as humans when these are applied. These also, in some cases, biomagnify, and in some cases, pesticides are at least suspected carcinogens, including the one we'll talk about next. So, no one's arguing today that pesticide exposure is anything but resulting in chronic effects as a result of chronic exposure. Fortunately, we have mostly left behind the pesticides that result in acute effects, but as we'll talk about here, the pesticides that we use today are suspected and in some cases demonstrated to result in chronic effects. Atrazine is the most widely used herbicide in the United States today. It's an extremely controversial herbicide. And so we see Tyrone Hayes on the screen there in the lower right-hand corner with a toad. Tyrone Hayes' work has been groundbreaking in terms of demonstrating the effects of atrazine on organisms that are found in the environment. And so these are chronic effects that he is demonstrating. Slight developmental effects, slight reproductive effects, and in some cases, slight even behavioral effects have been observed. We talked previously about the frogs that have multiple legs, such as the frog that we see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And so interestingly, this was a result, surprisingly, I think we would still put this in the chronic exposure category, but this was also the result of synergistic effects. And so this was the result of exposure to both parasitic nematodes and simultaneous exposure to pesticides, which split the developing limb buds, resulting in these multiple limbs in frogs. So it was tied to pesticide exposure, but not exclusively to pesticide exposure. It was also the result of those parasites. Roundup has been quite the controversial pesticide, especially recently. We're familiar with Roundup Ready crops, as we've talked about in class. Roundup has documented toxicity to amphibians and questionable toxicity to humans as well, if you're familiar with the recent news reports. Roundup is used so commonly by humans. You'll see it used nearly everywhere as you start to look at urban settings, universities, and especially agricultural areas. Finally, Bacillus thuringiensis corn, or BT corn, is of course a corn that is genetically modified to produce its own toxin. Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacterium that produces a toxin. That gene is transplanted to the corn, and the corn produces a toxin that kills the insects that would potentially eat it. Now, that's the good news, but the bad news is that the pollen of this corn is toxic. The pollen is consumed by insects, by the many pollinators that are present in the environment, and so it leads to the unintended death of these pollinators. The goal is to kill organisms, especially such as the western corn rootworm, that are feeding on the corn, not the pollinators. The pollinators are actually needed, but unfortunately, an unintended effect is the death of these pollinators as well. You may be aware that the health of some pollinators, such as bees, is a big focus in environmental science right now. It's not exclusively due to toxicity, but it's the toxicity of pesticides, but it's one of the factors that has led to declines in bee populations around the world. And then finally, the detritus that is produced by this corn. So, for example, the leftover leaves and stalks in the field that are washed into streams, this remains toxic and kills aquatic insects that are found in these systems close to the fields in which BT corn is grown.